Diver. You know what? Can we skip this?
NDAF.
Perfect.
Hi, welcome to the very second episode of NDAF, aka whatever the hell this is, a space in which neurodivergent folks and their friends can talk all things spectrumy in any messy direction they want. I'm Mark Wheaton, and this is my never speaking, perfectly silent producer engineer, Ken. Our guest this episode is Dan Whitehead. Dan writes everything. Comics, games, short stories, and writes about everything, having long covered games, movies, and TV for a number of different magazines and websites, including the great Fangoria. Of his many titles as a writer, I'm partial to his Ella upgraded comics about a girl who can, quote, gain the skills and abilities of her favorite video game characters, his mysterious HEX LOADER, featuring Combat Wombat, and then, as a Texan myself, his Frankenstein, Texas, which sees the monster escape to the Old West after the events of the Shelley novel. Frankenstein, Texas was published in Heavy Metal in 2020. Anyway, here's Dan Whitehead.
All right. Well, this is a grand experiment, Dan. So thank you for coming on here. It's one of those things like over the past few months, I've talked to more and more people in the neurodivergent community, and I've realized more and more the individualization of everyone's experience, making it almost like a counter monolithic story has really, every time I have another conversation about neurodiversity with somebody who's experiencing neurodiversity, it expands my understanding of how neurodiversity works in the media, how the stereotypes kind of impact, how tropes are going, especially with creatives and how they take that in and work into their own art. So here we are, the last Refuge of the Scoundrel of podcast. So I figured I'd see what you had to say.
Cool.
So I guess I wanted to start. Can you talk about your first experiences with, was it with comic books or with video games? What was the first kind of art that really made you say, I want to be a creative?
I mean, it was probably, it's hard to, I honestly can't remember the first time I saw a comic book just because they were always there and I was always into those. But I definitely remember the first time I played video games or computer games, as we called them. And that was that really made a huge impact on me. The idea that you could have something on the TV that you could control just seemed absolutely wild. So I think in terms of creativity, I loved comic books, but I never really thought I would make them. Whereas with computer games, I would get the magazines every month that told you what was coming out, and that just blew my mind. That was what I wanted to do, was to write for magazines about computer games. So that was definitely the first thing that kind of triggered that impulse in me, rather just consuming something. I wanted to write about it.
I think one of my favorite things about, I guess it's a few years on now, but when you wrote your book about the history of the Spectrum console, which we don't have here whatsoever, just your real focus on the storytelling. Gameplay is part of it, but I was fascinated in the reading page after page after page. Wow, there are intricate micro stories here. All these genre stories, crime, sci-fi, horror going on. When I was a kid, I didn't notice that. I was like, oh, it's Pitfall. Oh, it's Frogger. We didn't have that kind of until a Castlevania or a Contra came along. Was that something you noticed right away? Was it something that you were like, oh, okay, so you can tell these kind of micro tales and this kind of stuff?
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of that is kind of stuff I've kind of looked back and kind of noticed was there rather than realizing it was there at the time. But certainly, I mean, for American listeners, the games we're talking about were kind of early 80s, 82, 83 through to sort of 89 or so. So they weren't super sophisticated technically, but they were still very character driven in a way that arcade games weren't. Pac-Man doesn't really have a personality, you just eat stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas the games on the Spectrum, which was a Sinclair home computer, which again, like you say, in America just didn't make a dent whatsoever, but in Britain it was huge. It was created by this guy called Clive Sinclair, who was a kind of tinkerer and inventor, and he had this dream of everyone should have a computer in the home. So he basically designed these. They started out as actual kits that you'd put together yourself, but then you could actually buy them finished in the shops as well. And they retailed for £100 at a time when other computers cost £700. So they really kind of democratized the idea of having a computer. So you kind of got this strain of very, very British game design because they were just making games for this computer, which was only really popular in the UK. So they weren't really thinking about what are people in America going to think of this? What are people in Japan going to think of this? And so you got these very weird, graphic adventures like set in small British towns where you just kind of had to go around doing basic inventory puzzles and stuff. But yeah, there was definitely character to them that was beyond just you are cool dude, you must fight bad guy, save the day. You got these kind of weird little, almost like soap opera style graphic adventures. And yeah, that definitely had an impact on me, I think, this idea that games can be a lot more than just running and jumping.
How old were you when you realized there was like an authorial intent, when you realized there were actual people? Because when you're young, you don't even think of an author of a movie. People are like, oh, the actors just walk on screen and start talking. When did you realize there were actual personalities using this as a creative outlet, building these games?
Quite early on, I think, because the British games industry was so small. Like, one of the biggest companies at the time was called Ocean Software. They did like all the movie tie-in games and things like that. And they were based in Manchester, which was not far from where I lived. And, you know, on the adverts in magazines and stuff, they would have the address of the company. And I would go, hey, that's not far from me. Mm-hmm. And there was even a games company based in the very small town where I lived at the time. And I remember my dad telling me I would have been like, maybe 11 or so, and he said, you know, there's a games company over the shops they have like an office above the shops in town. So yeah, but I mean, what's funny, and kind of circling back to the neurodiversity thing, is I thought that was cool, but it never once occurred to me that I could like contact them. Like I should go and knock on the door and say, give me a job. It just... Well,
that was my next question. Why not?
I've no idea. No idea. It's one of those things I've always kind of wondered, why wouldn't I do that? It's, you know, it was something I was so into, like, you know, obsessively excited about computer games. And there were companies like, if not on my doorstep, then very, very close. And it never occurred to me. It wasn't like I thought of doing it and then chickened out. It just did not occur to me that I could speak to these people.
And when did that change?
I guess once I was old enough to actually have a job. And kind of financial necessity. Maybe I probably should try and talk to these people. But yeah, but at the time, I knew it was a thing that people did, but I did not know how to get into that.
You mentioned it in terms of neurodiversity. I know that I've had this in my own writing career, and I've met a number of other people who kind of find this ceiling in IT, or they're like, oh, I wish I could do this job, but people are like, no, you're lucky to be in this position. And there's kind of a ceiling, but I've always kind of wondered how much of it is one you assemble for yourself based on your own expectations of what you can accomplish and what you do not want to set yourself up for versus what's actually out there. What do you think?
I don't think I ever had that. I mean, the first job like I said, my dream job since like the age of sort of 9 or 10 was to write about computer games for magazines. And the very first job I got as an adult was writing about computer games in magazines. So I kind of achieved the dream pretty much straight away.
Right.
I'd just finished, I was going to say college, but I mean, to you guys, I guess it would be high school. And I hadn't even got my exam results. And there was an advert in the local newspaper for someone to work on a computer magazine. And it was based like down the road from my dad's house. And it was at the time when I was literally just ready to start going out into the world and getting a job. So it was very weird kind of, wow, that's almost meant to happen. So I applied for that job and I got it, and then that was it. I'd kind of achieved the dream straight away. So I don't know if that made me like weirdly cocky or kind of feel like I was kind of bulletproof in that regard, but whenever after that I kind of thought, oh, I'd quite like to do that, I would just find someone that was doing that and say, hey, can I do that as well? And I just kind of put myself out there and did that.
Because you had somebody to I mean, I remember when I was starting out as a film reporter, I was doing it because I was spending all my money on movie tickets. And I was like, oh, and I started seeing people online like, oh, getting into these screenings and not having to pay. And I was like, that's the job for me. And so I would watch them and then draft off of them. And now I realize some of that's just needing that fake it till you make it kind of thing of needing an example. You can't see it, you can't be it. And so you just kind of are like, oh, okay, if I follow those steps rigidly, I can also be Drew McWeeny at Any Cool News. So it just steps forward in that way.
Yeah, I think because I almost kind of walked into that job. I mean, I'm not, I think, it wasn't unearned, but it was definitely not, it didn't seem difficult. I didn't spend years applying for things, literally the first thing I applied for. And I think that just kind of made me think, well, that's how jobs work. You see the thing you want to do, and you write to the people who do it, and they like you and they give you a job. And that actually worked a couple of times, I think, maybe because it kind of gives you this weird sense of confidence, and maybe people are like, oh, wow, if he's just writing to us out of the blue, maybe we should listen, maybe we should hear him out.
I always thought 1,000 people were doing that, and then you find out you're literally the only person that ever tried that. So it kicks the door down.
There was a company, again, I was just, again, the local newspaper, there was an article. This was kind of mid to late 90s, so like the X-Files was huge, and I was really into all that kind of stuff. And there was a piece in the local paper about a publishing company nearby that was launching a sort of paranormal type magazine. And all of a sudden I went, oh, that's what I want to do now. That's way more exciting. So they didn't let me through the door straight away, but I just kept emailing, and I'm not emailing, but I just kept ringing them up and saying, hi, it's me again. I'd really like to work for you. Let me know. And eventually they said, fine, come on. And yeah, that was how I got in working on comics, because they also published loads of comics. They held the licenses for like Warner Brothers owned stuff, so all Cartoon Network and Hanna-Barbera stuff. And so it was kind of through wanting to write about X-Files type stuff, I ended up working on Scooby-Doo.
Can you talk about that, moving from being a critic, from writing nonfiction, being a fan, and kind of covering that, to then evolving into having your own creative voice, writing, whether it's prose, whether it's comics, whether it's in games, because obviously you've spread out your creative output across a lot of different media. How does that evolve for you? If you're like, yeah, I'm at the mountaintop, but I'm like 20 when you're writing about computers, when you start having that new goal of, I also want to do this. I want to do the stuff that I'm writing about.
Yeah, I think writing about stuff always seemed more achievable than writing the stuff that gets written about, just because that was stuff I saw regularly in the magazines that I read, and it just seemed like they were normal people doing that job, whereas I literally had no idea how you would go about doing anything else. The thing is, I always wrote stories, and I always made my own comics at home, things like that. But again, there was this kind of gulf of, I enjoy doing that, but is it a job? How do I go about making it a job? It's not something that gets advertised. So I just kind of, I guess, blundered around doing things that looked exciting and interesting until I kind of ended up there by accident.
So what was the first one? What was the first thing where you're like, oh, I'm the creator now. I have the authorial, in this fiction, whichever medium.
Yeah. So, it kind of went from doing it just for fun. I honestly can't remember why I wrote stories as a kid. I just knew I always did it and just always enjoyed it and never once thought of it as a work thing. But then, I'm working for this publishing company. And a lot of the stuff I was doing was kind of more production side, just getting the thing to the printers on time and things like that. But, you would get to kind of dip a toe in the creative side as well. And I think the first time when I really kind of thought, oh God, I'm writing a story that people will read as a story in the way that I've read other people's stories. Whereas you don't have them in America, but over here we have these things called annuals, which are kind of like hardback books, sort of slightly bigger than A4 size, about 64 pages, and they're always based on like popular TV shows and films and things. And I did the Star Wars ones for a couple of years, which was massive for me because I was a huge Star Wars fan, obviously. And the first one where I actually had to write more than just kind of, here's a character profile of Han Solo or whatever, was for Attack of the Clones. We were doing the episode 2 annual, and we were told, it's just going to be an adaptation of the film, basically. A kind of abridged, condensed prose retelling of the story of the film. And all of a sudden, that's when it hit me. I was like, oh my God, I'm rewriting Star Wars. And if this was 10 years ago, I would have been buying this book and reading it.
Oh.
I don't want to say it made me pause, but it definitely that was when I thought, oh shit, this is real.
Yeah. You're playing in the Lucasfilm sandbox. Yeah.
Yeah, I think before that, I'd never really thought about the fact I was writing things that lots of people would read. Because it was in print, you don't get that feedback that you get online. So it was just they come out and they come back from the printers and I'd hold it in my hands and go, wow, I made that, that's cool. But the idea that there were thousands of people buying it and reading it and having opinions about it didn't really occur to me. Weirdly. It was almost abstract.
I don't mean to jump ahead, but I'm surrounded by your stuff in this house. But how do you go from, I know how it goes for most people. You do something successfully, you get asked to do something else and it becomes creator owned. You talk about, though, your characters that you create in your comics are very specific. And you have young characters, you have people really engaged with video games in a way that no one else is doing. we kind of talk about when you started creating your own characters and like what kind of characters you were attracted to saying, nobody's doing this. How can I do that? How do you build your own characters, I guess?
I mean, again, I'd always created characters. I've still got in a pile behind me the comic books I made when I was like 7 or 8 years old. And it was basically just like, it was kind of like Tolkien via He-Man.
Right.
I mean, and quite how I didn't realise I was autistic then is a miracle. So yeah, a lot of the stuff I did like at that age was basically just copying stuff I liked and doing slightly different versions of it. I didn't really start writing my own stuff seriously with an eye to actually like putting it out there until maybe 10 years ago or so. And again, it's one of those things where it was like, it was always there. Obviously, that option was always there, and those options were always around me. But the idea that I could just do it for myself, again, didn't occur to me. And this is one of the things, I mean, I only got my diagnosis like a month ago. So I'm pretty
welcome to the resistance. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fresh out of the egg. And yeah, although I suspected for years and years and years, but it's only like the past month when it's been official. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about, all these kind of opportunities that I kind of didn't take or didn't realize were even there. And I'm trying to think, was that part of it? But as for how I come up with the characters, I don't know. It's often not so much that I come up with a character, it's more that I come up with an idea for a story or for a concept that would be interesting to explore. And then the character kind of comes out of that, of like, what would be the most interesting point of view to explore this from? Rather than, I'm trying to think if there's anything where I've ever actually just come up with a character and then just run with it. I think Ella Upgraded is probably the closest to that, which is my kind of like, I guess, middle grade graphic novel series about a girl who has an old video games console put in her brain so she can and she finds she can put the old cartridges in her brain and she gets the powers of whatever game she puts in there. That was probably the closest I came to like letting the character dictate the story rather than the other way around. But even there, it was because I wanted to write something that my daughter could read, because a lot of my stuff up to that point had been not like super mature readers only, but not appropriate for kids. But also I wanted to try and test myself to see if I could write in that kind of Silver Age comic book style, where what I wanted to do was I specifically wanted to see if I could set up a concept and a character in 6 pages, like they did in Amazing Fantasy 15, where like Spider-Man's origin takes 6 pages and then you're off Spider-Man now. So I wanted to see if I could do that. And I knew I kind of wanted to do something around that idea of, some people say it's kind of like the Matrix, that idea of you can just put anything in your brain and suddenly you've got those abilities. But it was more from like there's an old TV show called Joe 90, which was about a kid spy who sat in this weird machine and it gave him whatever knowledge he needed to do the next thing he needed to do. So it was also kind of inspired by that. But yeah, Ella herself just kind of emerged naturally from wanting to explore that idea in a fun way and write something that was fast and funny, and not my normal way of writing would be much more kind of, not ponderous, that sounds bad, but I would let conversations kind of bounce around and build character that way, and I wanted to do something where it was more defined through action.
That's interesting. You say, you hear this from time to time about like, were there opportunities I missed because of neurodiversity? In Ella Upgraded, you approach your characters with tremendous empathy, which is another hallmark of autistic writers. There's so much empathy and there's so much like warmth in that book. And there's so much like the family dynamic and everybody. You're not one of those writers who punishes your characters and puts them through a test and like everybody has to do this. It's a great, lovely story where you're like, you feel safe investing in, and they're funny and you're into it. And you're like, okay, this is totally middle grade. This totally works for this. And it's a great concept and it's really fun. And again, obviously there are all kinds of trade-offs with neurodiversity, but having that superpower of like being an empathetic writer, you might not have that on the other side of things. So I love that book.
Yeah, I mean, this actually came up when I was having my assessment, and the guy who was doing it was, we were talking about being a writer and things like that, and he was talking about how the stereotype is like autistic people struggle with emotion, they struggle to understand social interactions and things. So the idea of being a writer and writing stories is not counterintuitive, but it's not what people would expect, or you would expect you to get it wrong. But what I've realised is that sort of creating characters and writing stories is a way of rehearsing those kind of things, and I can run through a scene multiple different ways in my head until I work out what makes the most emotional sense for all of the characters involved in that conversation, which is obviously something you can't do in real life. But being able to do it through writing is really useful and therapeutic, I've realized.
I mean, sometimes we do that now. Do you ever rehearse emails? Do you ever rehearse conversation? Like, you're talking to somebody new. Do you have that version where it's kind of like, okay, this is going to be hard? I have that, where it's just like, I mean, this podcast is hard. It's that the idea of you have to go through it and go through it and go through it and rehearse and write scripts for yourself, and kind of just as a way of getting by. And for me, writing has kind of trained me how to do that. Do you have any of that in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things that I've always had, and it's one of those things that I've started to realize, oh, that was me trying to deal with this without knowing what it was called. That thing of, like you say, rehearsing conversations, or sometimes it's like before the conversation has happened or the interaction has happened. Sometimes it's afterwards. You kind of imagine different versions of it where, what if I'd done this? What if I'd said that? What I think is interesting is we've both got a background in kind of interviewing, and interviews are a really interesting kind of version of that, because you have, a clear agenda of, this is the copy I want to get, and these are the questions I'm going to ask, and this is the thing we're going to be talking about. So it gives you that framework of, it's not a random conversation. So weirdly, I've realized I was always more stressed out about, like, phoning the mechanic to ask about my car than I was about phoning Anthony Hopkins at his house in Malibu to talk about his new CD of classical music, which is something I've done. And at the time I was like, oh yeah, that's cool. But now I'm like, well, I just rang Anthony Hopkins at his house? That's mad. How did I do that without having a complete breakdown? But because it was clear what it was for. There was a framework that I could follow. And the fact that it was a very famous man didn't really register.
My wife talks about it in terms of hierarchies when she was talking about, like, oh, why I could do the interview. I think when you enter any kind of social interaction with a stranger, you're kind of not sure where you fit sometimes in the back and forth. And when you're interviewing T. Hopkins, fellow neurodiverse person, that he's up here and you're down there and you're promoting something for him. You're helping him do this. You try to come up with questions that won't be like anybody else's. You're not going to ask about Silence of the Lambs. You're just going to try to do the best version for him. And you just go in without that agenda and you do that thing. And it's easy because you're handing it all off. You don't have to do any kind of, it's the easiest mask in the world. You just hand it off and you get what you need. And you're a receptacle. You don't have to give of yourself. You just pull in. And so it's actually, and then you're like, haha, I have accomplished the task.
Yeah. It's funny because whenever that comes up in, like, social conversations that, some of the people I've interviewed, and people are like, oh my God, weren't you nervous? And it's like, I'm actually more nervous now telling you about it than I was there sitting with Tom Hanks or whoever, because even though that is a weird situation, there was a reason for it, and like you say, what the expectations are on both sides, and you're not going to be thrown for a loop unless you get someone who's, like, really grumpy in the interview, in which case that does throw you off. But it's always comedians who do that, I've found.
Yeah, funny because I think about Hopkins. I remember there have only been a couple of people I've interviewed at junkets where they're not receptive to the junket. They're there because they've been made to do it, and will just kind of bend their head low and kind of take the questions. Will not make eye contact. And now looking back, like, I didn't know what that was. But looking back, I'm like, that actor that everybody loves cannot do the social engagement thing. That person who everybody is like, oh, it's this person. It's like, no, that's part of this flurry of, like, as people come out with their diagnoses in the last couple of years, like, oh, that was that. That now makes sense. Yeah. It wasn't that thing of, oh, he was probably having a bad day. No, this is very hard. And they don't know why it's very hard for them, but they're still having to do press, 3 days of press for Warner Brothers on a weekend in Beverly Hills. And it's just a grind that leads to mental exhaustion. And now you're like, oh, that's why that person keeps their head down for the entire day. Radio interviews, junket interviews, round tables. You're like, oh, okay, I get it now. When did you first, autism, the word autism, what I thought it meant when I was 10 versus what I was told it meant in my 20s versus what I heard it was in my 30s versus a guy at Comic-Con talking about it in terms of his son, and my own like kind of, oh, that means this. It's changed radically over the last 40 years. Do you remember along the way kind of your first time encountering the word and how it's kind of evolved for you?
I mean, the first time I encountered the word, I imagine, would be something really cliche like Rain Man or something like that. And, this idea that it was kind of tied up in the kind of savant kind of concept of, oh yeah, autistic people can like work out pi in their heads in like 3 seconds and things like that.
They're superheroes, but they got to watch Jeopardy at 5 o'clock. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that was probably it. I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s in the UK where things like that were just not on the agenda at all. One of the big things that kind of stood out to me when I started wondering if I was on the spectrum was thinking back, and this really stuck in my mind at the time, so it must have triggered something even if I didn't realise it, was a lot of my school reports. There was one year when it seemed like all my teachers had almost conspired to write the same thing about me, which was, he seems bright, needs to pay more attention, is too glib. And at the time I was like, glib? You bastards! What? Kind of like are they insulting me here? But like years later, I kind of realised that's a pretty good kind of layman's description of being on the spectrum. But at the schools I was at that time, unless you were like non-verbal or it was causing like severe problems, it just would not have registered at all. Whereas by the time my son was diagnosed, it was like the schools were like, almost from like primary school, were kind of going, oh, he might be autistic, because they're trained to spot that stuff now. So I guess that was the big one for me, was when my son was diagnosed. I was like, oh, okay, this thing that I've heard of and kind of been vaguely aware of is now something I need to know about and need to understand. And then when he got his diagnosis, and I'm sure this is very common for a lot of kind of parents of my age, is when you get a child who's diagnosed, and then you kind of go, wait a minute, is this about me? Because their assessment is like, hey, that's me at that age. And then the kind of light bulb goes off.
I was at Children's Hospital when my daughter was being diagnosed, and my wife and I are standing, and doctors like, and as we know, it easily descends through a parent. Like the whole room just looks at me, and my wife just kind of turns to me, and I'm like, okay, so we're starting a new cycle here. And it was just kind of like, it just became a series of doctors being like, and of course, it's one of you. And everybody knew it was me. And I was like, okay, got it. I see where this is going now.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it was, I showed my mum, the kind of the assessment report for my son, and she literally said, this is you, basically. And I was like, yeah, it is, isn't it? I wonder if that means something. And it still took me a long time to kind of actually get around to getting diagnosed myself after that, because to begin with, I thought, yeah, maybe I am okay. But you kind of get that thing of, well, I've made it this far. Clearly I've, it's never done me any harm, as they say. But then, over years, sort of pieces start to fall in place. And a lot of the, I guess, subconscious masking techniques that I just kind of developed as a way of surviving kind of stopped working because I was aware of them now. And I kind of go, oh, wow. Oh, well, yeah, that's why I'm doing that. And then once I was aware of it, I couldn't do it. I've always kind of described it as just like, it's like when Wile E. Coyote runs off the edge of a cliff, but he doesn't fall down until he realised he's gone off the edge of the cliff. And that was what it was like for me. It was like, all of a sudden I realised, like, oh, there's nothing under my feet anymore. And then all the kind of sort of coping mechanisms that I kind of organically built up just fell away, and I sort of fell down to earth in a puff of smoke.
It's funny because the author Shannon McGuire, who's neurodivergent, writes the Wayward Children series, and the book is not, characters are not specifically neurodivergent. The plot is, and it's versions of Alice back from Wonderland, Dorothy back from Oz, Wendy back from Never Never Land. All these people who have returned, and their parents are like, who are you? What's wrong with you? And they're like, no, we saw this amazing thing. And they're like, no, you're not the child I want anymore. And they're all sent to like the special school, which is a hallmark of all kinds of neurodivergent writing, where they can be kind of, where the person who runs it is also someone who has come back from a fantasy land. Persephone come back from the underworld. And it's so much about, and when Shannon's talked about it, it's when you've been allowed to unmask, when you've allowed to be your little, as she says it, gremlin self, and then you have to mask again, it's 10 times harder. And I found that with COVID, there was like 2 years where I didn't have to socialize with anybody. Coming out of that and suddenly seeing parents again, suddenly having to do all these little micro interactions, it's like you're just getting hit with a bat. You're like, oh, I forgot how to even mask. Yeah. And it was really hard. Have you found that over there?
Yeah, no, definitely. That was, yeah. I mean, obviously, it was a horrible time, but at the same time, there was something about it. It was just like your world is kind of reduced to this very tiny sphere of what you need to do, and there's a weird kind of comfort in that. I felt the same. I was very seriously ill about 25 years ago and spent quite a long time in hospital, and I get weirdly nostalgic for that sometimes, which is weird because I wasn't at death's door, but I was kind of on the path up to the door, kind of in death's porch, I guess.
The door to your grave was open.
Yeah. So, you shouldn't really be nostalgic for that, but there was something very freeing about just not having to worry about anything else. About, it's just, okay, your life is basically zoomed down to like a tiny this is what you need to do now. And everything else, all the sort of day-to-day stuff just vanishes. So yeah, that, I guess clarity is what it is. It's none of the clutter. There's none of the, oh, I need to do this, I need to go there, and then I need to do this. It's just, no, you need to sit there and not die. And I guess there was a real echo of that in lockdown. Less urgency, but, certainly a similar kind of feel of, what you need to do is just stay in this one space and, not interact with things.
Well, and you have the routine. You crave a routine. You have the schedule. There's nothing going to surprise you. There's nothing you're not ready for across the day. There's no phone call to the mechanic. You just go. So, I don't know, one day it worked for me. So, next question is might be personal. And on the show, one of the rules is if there's something that you think about and are like, actually, I want to take that out because neurodiversity is messy. And sometimes you want to be like, I don't want to look at that. That's allowed. I share a lot of traits with my own daughter, and then we diverge in crazy ways when it comes to how our autism is expressed. You have that with your son, where you have like, oh, I recognize that when he was 6. I recognize that when he was 8. Recognize that because I do that. And then now that you both have a diagnosis, there's also things where it's like, no, it's not like that at all.
I'm genuinely not sure. I think I'm still kind of working through that because I'm still so, the ink's still drying on the assessment formally, officially. So yeah, I'm not sure. I do know that him knowing he's autistic from like a very early age has definitely changed the way he deals with it. I mean, obviously it would, but I think the big one is that he doesn't seem to have felt the need to or had the pressure to conform in the way that I did, and that feeling of, I need to be normal, I need to do normal person things, kind of led me to do stupid shit when I was a teenager and in my 20s and stuff, because I would see other people, oh yeah, we're going to do this. Oh yeah, okay, let's do it. And I would do it more. I would like throw myself into it, almost to like prove that I can fit in and do these things.
Well, prove how neurotypical you could be.
Yeah, so I had a lot of difficulty kind of with moderation, I guess. My first year away at university was very difficult, partly because, I was having to live in like a dorm, you would call it, surrounded by very boisterous, kind of laddish kind of blokes, and that was just not me at all. So I definitely wasn't alcoholic, but I was on the road to it. I kind of realized I'm getting very, very drunk a lot of the time, and often not even socially. And thankfully, I kind of finally sort of made a small group of friends where I could be more of myself, and I kind of got myself out of that environment. And even though, I still drank too much and things like that, it didn't feel dangerous anymore. It didn't feel like I was doing it for stupid reasons.
Yeah. I have the same thing with Comic-Con. I drank at Comic-Con because I wouldn't drink the rest of the year. But at Comic-Con, I'm around strangers, I'm around other people, and it's a cheap mask. And you're just kind of like, okay, this is the cheap way to make everything easier because otherwise I'm just going to get in my own way.
Yeah.
So,
One incident like that springs to mind for me was I was at a press event for Activision. This was kind of late 90s, maybe 98, 99. I think it was for that game they did with Bruce Willis. Apocalypse, Armageddon, something like that. And it was like a hotel down near London. And I got there and there's like a big kind of party social thing going on. And I just drank. I just drank and drank and drank. Literally just straight off the train, went into there, started drinking. And I passed out, smashed my head on the table, woke up back in my hotel room, and like the PR people were like, oh my God, are you okay? Because obviously they were worried I was going to sue them or something. But yeah, that was another kind of a big. That's not a normal way to cope with a social situation. But it was okay because, I got to have room service in the hotel and Toby Hooper's remake of Invaders from Mars was on TV. So I was really happy with that. That was a good outcome for me. I got to get out of the social situation and watch a sci-fi movie on TV instead.
I remember I had to go meet a director once for a job for a screenwriting thing in New York. And it wasn't alcohol, but I was nervous about meeting him. And I must have sat in my hotel room, drank like 6, 7 Diet Cokes, just one right after another, like psyching myself. I go to his place in Soho and I suddenly had an accent when I was talking to him, because I'm from Texas. And I suddenly put on like that fake Texas accent. And that has happened a few times in my life when I'm just so psyched out and suddenly I have an accent. And we had a great conversation. And it was a fantastic meeting. But it was that thing of, as soon as I left, the next time, every time from here on that I have to talk to him, I'm going to have this masky accent. And I was just like, oh no, what have I done? And it was like a really good meeting of the minds. But as long as I'm talking like I'm from, middle of nowhere, and it was just because I was trying to, I don't even know what. It just make a hierarchy, make oh, you don't have to worry about little old me kind of thing. Yeah. It's just, now looking back, it's just mind blowing. Who would do that? Who would not just have, he wanted me in New York. He wanted to talk about this project. But in my mind, I'm like, I cannot handle this. So I go in overdosing on caffeine and just kind of lose it. And I don't know. It was it's great moments in one's autistic social interactive history. So
I think what's funny about stuff like that is it's not something you chose to do. It's not like you thought, I'll do an accent that will help. It's just something in your brain went, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah,
you're going to sit with the consequences.
It's great. It's a cabaret neurodiversity. So you mentioned Rain Man as one of those early, I certainly had that. I didn't know at the time. The first time I saw neurodiversity written about this before and was like, wow, I don't know why, but that's me, was when Anthony Hopkins played Stevens in Remains of the Day. And learning now that he was later diagnosed and just kind of put that into there, the routines of Stevens, the life of Stevens, being a certain, loving a hierarchy, not being able to emotionally diverge from. I'm like, oh, I get why that appealed to me. And something like Rain Man, I liked Dustin Hoffman acting a lot, but it never rang true to me as, oh, that's what I have. And this is long before I know I had anything. Do you have any of those? There are good versions or bad versions of representation?
I mean, one thing I found is that as a young white guy growing up in the 70s and 80s, it's very hard to kind of unpick what was autism and what was just the fact that nerdy guys like me were kind of at the heart of pop culture for a good sort of 2 decades there. Right. It's funny you say Anthony Hopkins, though, because 84 Charing Cross Road was one for me.
That's a great movie.
And yeah, it's brilliant. But it's also absolutely not the kind of movie I would normally watch. And yeah, that was one where I knew I liked his character and I was drawn to the way he lived that life. I mean, a lot of it was to do with the era it was set in, the 1950s, where it was, very kind of buttoned down and very controlled. But there was, I've always wondered why I enjoyed that movie so much at the time when I was mostly watching Dawn of the Dead and stuff like that, and the 84 Charing Cross Road is kind of in there as well, and it's a bit of an outlier. And another one is Harrison Ford in Mosquito Coast. And I mean, I'm not even sure if that character's supposed to be neurodiverse, but again, it's one of those ones I watched it because I thought, oh, it's Han Solo, Indiana Jones. This will be cool. He's in a jungle. And then it's obviously not that at all. But I was still absolutely hooked by it. Again, like 84 Charing Cross Road, at the time, I didn't understand why am I so fascinated by this character who's so sort of fixated and obsessed with this one idea. But yeah, I mean, maybe that was it. But I've not dug into it enough to say for sure that was the kind of Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen .gif reaction. But those are two movies that I remember having a very profound reaction to as a young guy that I never really understood. I mean, they're both great movies, so it's not like it's a complete shock, but they were very much out of sync with what I was into at that time. So there was definitely something there that spoke to me, even if I didn't realize why at the time.
Funny that you mentioned Mosquito Coast. When I was a few minutes ago talking about being in a junket, and someone who talks like into their hands and doesn't make eye contact and doesn't know anything, I was specifically talking about Harrison Ford at K-19, The Widowmaker.
I thought you were.
And he was just, Catherine Bigelow comes in and she wants to talk about it and like really has all this. Ford doesn't want to deal with us. And I was like, oh, he's famous. He doesn't want, but it was very, and I really don't want to like be like, oh, so he must, I don't want to be the guy who's like, that person's neurodiverse, that person's neurodiverse, that person's neurodiverse. It's not that. It's just when he was doing that, I recognized something in me, whether it is or not. And I was just like, oh, I understand what's going on at the end of the table there. He doesn't want to be here. He doesn't, and if that's university or if that's just exhaustion, the way he responded was really going internal and really not talking and really just, you could tell he just didn't want to be in there.
Shutting down,
Yeah, he was shutting down completely.
I mean, when he was kind of back on the junket circuit for like Force Awakens and Indiana Jones coming back and all that, I think there was quite a few people kind of going, he's got social anxiety syndrome and kind of armchair diagnosing him and stuff. I don't know if it's something he actually said, but there's a quote going around where he says, I don't have social anxiety syndrome. I just hate boring situations. And I'm kind of thinking, that's not a no. It's, the reason you find them boring might be.
So with your own writing, going back to Ella, it's such a character where you're kind of like, the idea of wanting to be this thing, wanting to be not necessarily better than yourself, but wanting to have that magic way of changing your brain. Is it something that you now want to write about? Do you want to write about? Do you feel you've always been writing kind of versions of it? Or are you planning to maybe, as you've done in the past, now that you have the name for it, now that you know what to call it, have you considered writing about your own neurodivergent experience, or are you going to continue to write versions of it that don't go into that? Like, kind of where do you fall in that with your own creative work?
I think I need to kind of sit with it a lot longer before I would have any kind of confidence in like writing about it overtly.
Yeah.
I think now that I know, I'm definitely going to be conscious of how that manifests in the characters I write. I'd never actually thought of that with Ella, actually, and that's really interesting. Again, it just did not. Maybe that was a subconscious thing. That did not. I just thought it was like a fun kind of thing that a kid would go, yeah, I want to be able to do that. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that's what I was trying to do. There's a character in a graphic novel I did called HEX LOADER, which
another great comic,
which is completely different. Again, it's more like a kind of Hellblazer, John Constantine kind of story. But the main character in that is probably the closest I've ever come to writing myself in a story. It's sort of the sort of top level thing is it's set in again, computer games are related. Set in the 80s, this guy, his best friend from school, becomes this like famous reclusive game designer. What he's actually doing is finding a way to use computer code to cast spells to sort of deal with the occult. And he disappears and his friend gets this cassette through the post that has the code on it. And he plays the tape through his computer and it triggers this kind of change in his brain. And then he kind of has to embark on this like odyssey away from Manchester where he lives, which is where I live, down to London, which is, much bigger, sort of scarier place. And a lot of the kind of character level story in that, not necessarily like the plot stuff, is about feeling sort of disconnected, out of place, not sure how to be around these people. They're all cool and know what they're doing. I've got no idea. And when I was writing it, I was always very concerned that the main character was not what you're supposed to do in a story. He was very reactive rather than proactive. He wasn't sure what he wanted when the idea is, you should always have clarity of what your characters are doing. And that was one of the few books I've written where the story kind of told itself. I kind of wrote that using the Stephen King method, where I just sat down with the idea and just wrote, and the story just kind of came out. So yeah, that's probably the closest I've come. But even then, I'm thinking about some of the other stuff I've done there. Frankenstein, Texas, as kind of like gothic western. Again, not something that I wrote thinking, this will mean something, this will have amazing psychological insights. But the character of the Frankenstein monster in that is very kind of withdrawn, very taciturn, very sort of rigid morality. And I'm kind of looking at him now and thinking, is that an aspect of it as well? I'm going to start writing the second book of that very soon, and that's definitely at the front of my mind. Is my understanding of that character, is that informed by neurodiversity? Is his kind of wanting to be around people but not necessarily having to deal with them?
Yeah.
Is that a thing that I'm kind of putting in there without realizing? So yeah, I'm starting to see that it comes through in a lot of the stuff I've done, and in the non-fiction I do as well. Most of my non-fiction stuff, like the Speculation book you mentioned before, those are probably the most screamingly autistic things I've done, because it is just literally, I will come up with a list of a thing I want to write about, and I'll do a long list, and then I will work through that list, whether it's films or games, whatever, and I will go through the list and I will watch or play each one, and then I will write about them, and then I'll move on to the next one. I'm writing a book at the moment about kind of British sort of genre movies from like 1950 through to the 2000s. And again, I've drawn up a long list, and I'm going through it, and every day I watch a film on the list and I write about it, which is a great structure for getting a book written.
Right.
But at the same time, it is also like so obviously just, I am imposing a structure on this, and I'm rigidly following that structure and routine. And the fact a book comes out of it at the end, I think, is maybe a little bit coincidental. I might be doing this anyway, even if I wasn't going to publish it as a book. But one of the other big things that kind of made me go, obviously I am, is when I was about maybe 21, 22, typically at an age where, a young man's, sowing his wild oats and things like that. I spent the summer, there was a kind of part work magazine in the UK called The Unexplained. One of those kind of, you buy the first one and you get the free binder, and then you keep buying them.
Yeah.
And I found like a complete collection of those. I think it was published in 1980. I found a complete collection, like secondhand, but there was no index. So I spent a summer as a young 20-something man basically creating an index, going through them all on my computer, like breaking down every topic that was mentioned on every page, and then cross-referencing all the page numbers. And I never once thought that was a weird way to spend my summer.
Right.
But it's like now, it's like, again, it's kind of what I'm doing with the books I write, with a bit more purpose. But at the time, I was just like, no, this is fun. I'm enjoying this. This is
bringing
cool.
order to chaos. Yeah.
Yeah, But like I say, that was one of the things where I suddenly realized, like, God, yeah, I did that, didn't I? And then I was like, how did I not know? If I'm sat there for like 3 weeks, blazing sunshine outside, all my friends are out doing cool, sexy things, and I'm in here poring over an old spreadsheet.
I have the same experience that I was at UT. Everybody was partying on Friday night. I'm writing radio plays for the community radio theater that we had on campus, and we recorded at like 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning, and it's just like, no, you guys go party. I have to write 38 radio plays because it's just radio. And one last question, though, because we're running out of time, but I don't want to steal too much of your time. What did you see first? Did you read the Mary Shelley Frankenstein, or did you see the movie first, the James Whale?
I would have seen the movies first. Yeah, I was definitely more aware of the Karloff Frankenstein, and then later on the Hammer ones.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't read the book until much later, until I was like sort of late teens.
I ask because the monster is a touchstone I've noticed among some other people in neurodiverse community and horror community especially. When you see the movie, he's the stumbling, linny, monosyllabic, nonverbal, tries to give the flower to the girl. That doesn't work. So he throws her in when it floats. And like, he's just a monster in that way of the way neurodiversity used to be shown in movies and was in Of Mice and Men, Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. The book, of course, has this massive interior life. He is verbal. He is this other thing. And there's this weird progression. And I've always kind of wondered with specifically Frankenstein's monster, if that sets me up for looking for the interiority of like a Jason Voorhees or a Mummy or any of those other characters that Whale decided to do a certain thing with the monster. And where he moves away from the book is wiping out who he actually is, the personality, the thoughts, the lived in life. That is what I assume we're going to see with the Guillermo del Toro Frankenstein. And I was wondering, do you ever, when you look at Frankenstein's monster, I root for the monster. And I always have been attracted to rooting for the monster. Is any of that because Frankenstein, Texas takes on the book almost as much as it takes on the mythos that we kind of come away with from the movie? Was that something that you were like, okay, this isn't the like the kind of plotting Frankenstein? How did you decide on your Frankenstein?
That's interesting. Do you know what? I don't remember consciously deciding that that's what he would be. I just I knew I wanted to do a Frankenstein story set in the Wild West because I've always been obsessed by the idea that, you know, the era of Frankenstein in Europe, in the Americas, was the Wild West, you know, the contemporary, basically. So I'd always found that kind of juxtaposition really interesting. But when I sat down to kind of write the monster, I don't really remember thinking, aha, yes, I will kind of I'll give him this kind of interior kind of desire for redemption, and, you know, I will make that his sort of his motivating force. It just came naturally. And it's one of those things where I almost don't want to probe too hard as to where it came from, because I don't want to break the spell.
Right.
You know, I don't want to kind of suddenly do what I did, you know, end up like Wile E. Coyote again and kind of going, oh my God, I've shown myself how the trick works and now I can't get it back.
It's a metaphor. Uh-oh.
Yeah. I know some writers who use metaphors and they're all cowards. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I love writing the monster more than I like writing Victor. He's so much more interesting because he has this kind of conflict of, you know, or certainly the one I've written in Frankenstein, Texas is, you know, he's a creature of violence in a violent place at a violent time, but he really doesn't want to be. And at the end of Frankenstein, Texas, he basically ends up as the sheriff of this sort of small town. And that's what I'm kind of wrestling with at the moment is, okay, where do we take him next now that he's in this position of protecting people? You know, what's the most interesting way to challenge that? What's the most interesting way to develop that and send it off in a different direction while still kind of picking up the plot threads and doing all the sequel stuff? So yeah, that's what I'm still working through at the moment.
So what are we going to see next from you? Is it going to be the next Frankenstein, Texas? Is it going to be the book on British horror? What's the next thing that our 4 readers or listeners, yeah, I'm really used to podcasting, and the listeners can get off the shelf from you?
That's a good question. I'm up to the late 70s with the British genre films book, and the number of films kind of drops off in the 80s and 90s. So I think I'm over the hump on that one.
What's the most recent one? What was yesterday's movie? Or today's movie?
It was Norman J. Warren's Prey.
Oh, wait. Oh, I'm thinking of a different movie. That's not the dogs one.
No.
Oh,
It's an alien comes to Earth, disguises himself as a man, kind of ingratiates himself into an old country house occupied by 2 lesbians, and then it's kind of like this weird psychological chamber piece with a flesh-eating alien. And it's a Norman J. Warren film, so it's very trashy, but it's also very interesting and weird in a way that a lot of these films aren't usually. So that's a good one. I've not actually written it up yet. I'm still kind of chewing over what I want to say about it. But yeah, that will probably be done quite quickly, sort of maybe early next year, and I'll be probably self-publishing that one. So once it's done, I'll just tidy it up and get it out there. Frankenstein, Texas, the second one, that's going to be late next year, I guess. You know, I need to write it, and then David Hitchcock, the artist, needs to draw it. So yeah, that's probably going to be late 2025, maybe early 2026.
I hate to say that was my last question, but I do have one back. Would you talk about your photography?
Yes, sir.
Would you talk about your pictures they're not always geometric. They're not always, but they're very, I'm at a loss on how to actually talk about artistic photography. I don't have the vocabulary, but you do have a real attention to empty spaces, to crumbling spaces, to darkness within spaces, with shadows within spaces, and just uninhabited spaces. And if they are inhabited, they're inhabited by the natural world. Do you see a through line in what you go looking for in your photography?
That is something I've always been drawn to. Again, the photography is a thing that I always just wanted to do it just for fun. And then this year I kind of caved in and did a book of my photographs of empty shops. So there's a bit of a political dimension to that, because basically lots of towns in Britain are just emptying out, and lots of sort of high streets have got multiple just shops that are just dead and empty. And I was kind of fascinated by these sort of like these spaces in these streets that we walk across every day, and there's like these just gaps that we just kind of block out. What I do with those photographs is, a lot of the time, it's more about what the location gives me rather than me trying to get something out of the location, because, I can't get into these places. So often what I do is I'll just find like a gap in the window or the door where I can get my phone up against the glass and just take a picture of whatever's inside. So often the angles I take them from are kind of dictated for me. And so there's a sense of, this is what you get. I quite like not imposing my will on them in a weird way. I like just taking the picture and seeing what I get, and then the editorial choices in which ones I keep and which ones I don't use. But yeah, no, I've always been sort of fascinated by empty, abandoned buildings, and I'm not sure where that comes from, but I do find them very peaceful. And, it's that whole sort of thing of liminal spaces, I guess, which has kind of become a bit of an internet thing now, but I've always been fascinated by that. I do wonder, actually, my paternal grandmother lived in quite a big house, not because she was wealthy or anything, it's just because the houses they built back then were big, and, she bought it in like the 1930s or whatever. But yeah, her house, the upstairs in her house was always very quiet and empty and dark, and a sense of heaviness. Not in a bad way, but just, the wallpapers were thick, and the paint was thick, and the banisters were very sort of heavy oak and things like that. And I don't know, I think as a kid that just had quite a sort of, I found them calming but also exciting spaces like that.
Right.
So I don't know, maybe that's what I'm trying to recapture. But yeah, I do. I've got an idea for a sort of young adult novel that kind of comes out of this, but I'm still trying to figure out how that comes together.
About returning to a sensory space that's familiar, like returning to a controlled sensory space? This
would be probably the first thing I've written where the protagonist is autistic on purpose and overtly. But yeah, I'm sort of trying to figure out the sort of dimensions of that character and that story and how it would all fit together. It's one of those ones where I've kind of got scenes in my head that I want to write, but I need to figure out what happens in between those scenes and why.
I can honestly say it took me 3 years between starting to understand about my daughter and my own autism before I felt comfortable writing this little novella I did for Off Limits, Who Haunts You. And that's the first time I wrote a character that I called autistic. There are plenty of other characters looking back. You're like, autism. But there was like, okay, I feel I have the vocabulary. I feel I have this. I still got so much wrong. And I still people would write me, teachers and all would be like, oh, this is great. Or this is what I feel. Or this is how this is. And then somebody would be like, but this, and I was like, you're right. And so it's one of those things where you never educate yourself enough, it feels, because things are changing. A connection you weren't able to make or people hadn't made 2 years ago, they're making today, and they're like, that is actually this. And you think it's that. Like deafness. I used to think I couldn't hear, and now I know in situations with a lot of people, but now I understand, oh no, I wasn't able to isolate conversation. So more than 3 people talking, it became a dull thrum in my head. And I never really knew that was also autism. So it took a while before I felt safe enough to actually be like, okay, I'm going to write about this. And I realize now if I did it again, there's 100 things I do differently also. Yeah. But I'm glad that I did it. And I'm glad I'm going to write the next one. So I will look forward to reading Here's When It Hits. I have to say, I'm looking forward to Frankenstein, Texas.
Yeah, that idea has been bubbling away in my head for a long time. So I'm not sure when that'll be ready to pop out. But yeah, it feels like it's getting closer.
Thank you for talking to me today. As you say, as the ink is still drying on your assessment.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
1 month later.
It's been almost like therapy, kind of, I get to express these thoughts out loud for the first time.
Yeah, it is. It's a thing. And talking to people, like sending it out to be blurbed by people I knew who had children or they themselves were autistic, people don't talk about it. Our generation doesn't really talk about it. We don't have the vocabulary. My daughter, all her friends, they're all like, they know how to talk about it. It's everywhere. They've got the language. They're like, oh, that's that. Like, just they got everything. And I feel like our generation is so like kind of crawling through the dark, being like what's, and just the kids got it. We don't. So it's good to talk about it, I guess. So thank you for coming on, whatever this is.
Thank you for inviting me onto whatever this is. It's been fun.
And that's Dan. You can check out links to all his stuff at danwhitehead.net, DanWhitehead.net, including his multiple upcoming convention appearances, or you can follow him on his Blue Sky account, also handled danwhitehead.net. Anyway, you can follow the show on NDAF Show at Instagram, Blue Sky, wherever. And we hope you'll join us on the very next episode for another conversation about all things neurodivergent.
NDAF.
NDAF is produced by Ken Plume, and our theme song is by Mike Furman.